I remember exactly where I was in medical school when the illusion completely shattered for me.
Oh, really? Was there a specific moment?
Yeah, there really was. When you go through clinical training, there's this very specific, rigid worldview you internalize just to survive it all.
Right, it's all about the hard science.
Exactly. It's a world governed by absolute observable realities.
Mm.
I mean, a molecule is a molecule. It possesses a specific atomic weight, it binds to a very specific receptor in the human nervous system, and it triggers a predictable cascade of events.
And you can measure the outcome every single time.
Yes, there's just no negotiating with it. The biology simply is what it is, completely indifferent to your politics, your zip code, or, your personal philosophy. And for most of my adult life, I projected that exact same kind of empirical purity onto the United States Supreme Court.
Which is a very comforting projection, honestly.
It is.
I mean, you look at the architecture of the institution, the marble pillars, the isolated chambers, the neutral black robes, and it's all entirely designed to project this sanctuary of pure reason.
Right, exactly.
It suggests a process where, 9 brilliant legal scientists receive a messy human dispute, run it through the objective centrifuge of the Constitution, and hand down an empirical result.
And that was genuinely my grade school civics understanding of the judicial branch. I really pictured them completely insulated from all the partisan noise, just reading the plain text of the law and applying it.
But then reality hits.
But then came March 21st, 2000.
Ah, yes. FDA v. Brown and Williamson.
Right. The Supreme Court handed down its decision, and by a single razor-thin vote, 5-4, the court ruled that the Food and Drug Administration could not regulate nicotine.
Which is just wild when you think about it.
It's mind-blowing. This is the federal agency quite literally tasked and funded by you, the taxpayer, to regulate drugs to keep the public safe.
And it created this fascinating collision between the clinical definition of a substance and the statutory definition of a government agency's jurisdiction.
It created intense cognitive dissonance for me as a doctor. Because medically speaking, nicotine is undeniably a drug.
Right, there's no debate there.
None. It is literally the name of a pharmacological class. We have nicotinic acetylcholine receptors mapped out in our brains.
Yeah, the science is completely settled.
When someone inhales tobacco smoke, the nicotine crosses the blood-brain barrier in about 7 to 10 seconds. It hijacks the dopamine reward pathways, alters the user's heart rate, constricts blood vessels, and drives this deep, profound physical dependence that rewires the brain's baseline chemistry.
Wow.
Yeah. It is a drug in the purest, most terrifyingly effective sense of the word. So looking at this ruling as a doctor, it felt like watching a judge legislate gravity out of existence.
That's a great way to put it.
How could the highest court in the land look at an undeniable biological fact and declare it legally untouchable by the nation's drug oversight agency?
Well, because the court wasn't actually answering a question about biology.
Right, which is the crazy part.
They were answering a question about administrative law. The gap you experienced in that moment, that sheer bewilderment of seeing a physical reality rejected by a legal ruling, is exactly the friction we are exploring in this deep dive today.
Because the law doesn't map neatly onto the periodic table?
Exactly. Nor does it map neatly onto public health crises. The law maps onto statutory text, and statutory text is drafted, negotiated, and compromised by human politicians.
So we're going to use that single baffling tobacco ruling from the year 2000 as our doorway into a massive foundational exploration of how this system actually operates.
It's just such an important journey to take.
It really is.
Yeah.
Our premise for this deep dive is simple for you listening at home. The Supreme Court is a human political institution, and acknowledging that reality is not an act of cynicism or despair.
No, not at all.
It's a necessary act of civic realism.
And to understand the mechanics of that realism, we really have to dissect how the FDA found itself in front of the Supreme Court in the first place.
Right. How did we even get there?
Well, this requires looking at the historical context of the 1990s. For decades, the FDA had essentially just left the tobacco industry alone.
Which seems crazy in hindsight.
Oh, totally. But there was this prevailing kind of unspoken assumption that cigarettes were uniquely carved out of standard drug regulations, and that was largely due to the massive economic and political footprint of tobacco-producing states.
But the clinical evidence was mounting to a point where it could no longer be ignored by anyone in the public health sector.
Right, the data was just overwhelming.
We weren't just talking about abstract risks anymore. We were looking at lung cancer rates, emphysema and cardiovascular disease on a literal epidemic scale.
And simultaneously, you had these explosive internal industry documents leaking to the public.
But man, those documents.
Yeah, they were damning. They proved undeniably that tobacco executives were not just passively selling a plant. They were actively chemically engineering their products, manipulating nicotine levels specifically to initiate and sustain addiction.
And they were particularly targeting younger demographics to secure lifetime users. Just incredibly dark stuff.
Extremely dark. And that revelation of deliberate chemical manipulation is what fundamentally changed the legal strategy.
Enter Commissioner David Kessler.
Exactly. Under Kessler's leadership in 1996, the FDA decided to make an unprecedented move. They didn't go to Congress to ask for a new law.
Which is key here.
Right. They looked at their existing mandate and issued this massive, comprehensive rule asserting full regulatory jurisdiction over cigarettes and smokeless tobacco.
And they went hard, too.
They really did. They focused heavily on youth access, restricting vending machines, banning billboard advertising near schools, and requiring stringent age verification.
But if they didn't ask Congress for new authority, they had to base this massive power grab on something already on the books, right?
Yes.
They had to prove they already possessed the key to the tobacco industry's lock.
And for that key, they turned to their foundational text, the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, commonly referred to as the FDCA.
Okay, let's unpack the FDCA, because the origins of this act are vital to understand.
They really are. The FDCA wasn't written in a vacuum. It was passed in the immediate aftermath of the elixir sulfanilamide tragedy in 1937.
Oh, that was a horrific event.
Truly awful. A pharmaceutical company used a toxic solvent, essentially antifreeze, in a liquid medication, and it killed over 100 people, many of them children.
So the statute was deliberately written with incredibly broad language to ensure the government had the flexibility to capture unforeseen chemical threats.
Exactly. It was forged in the fire of a public health emergency. So in 1996, the FDA looks at this sweeping mandate from 1938, which gives them authority over drugs and devices.
And the FDCA defines a drug as any article intended to affect the structure or any function of the body.
Right. So the FDA's legal team constructed this masterful literalist argument based on that.
Walk us through it.
They categorized the nicotine compound as the drug because it explicitly affects the structure and function of the human nervous system. Then they categorized the cigarette itself, the paper, the specialized filter, the combustion mechanism as the delivery device.
That is so clever.
It was. By combining the two, they argued that a cigarette is functionally indistinguishable from a complex medical device delivering a controlled substance.
And I have to say, from a clinical standpoint, that diagnosis is flawless.
It makes total sense, right?
Completely. It operates on the exact same mechanical principle as a transdermal fentanyl patch for chronic pain or an albuterol inhaler for asthma.
Right. The drug is separate from the delivery method.
Yeah, the active medication is the drug, and the plastic casing or the adhesive patch is the device. You combine them, and the FDA regulates the entire package down to the microgram.
Makes perfect logical sense.
It really does. So it makes perfect sense that a highly engineered paper tube designed to aerosolize an addictive alkaloid into the lungs falls under that exact same regulatory umbrella.
It is a brilliant piece of statutory interpretation by the agency. But, when the tobacco industry inevitably sued and the case climbed all the way to the Supreme Court by the year 2000, we kind of hit the limits of clinical logic.
This is where Justice Sandra Day O'Connor comes in.
Yes.
Yeah.
She drafted the majority opinion in that 5-4 decision, completely striking down the FDA's rule.
Which is just a cup and...
But to understand her logic, we have to step away from the dictionary definition of the word drug and look at the specialized mechanics of how courts review agency actions.
Okay, so this brings us into the territory of administrative law.
Exactly.
Because the FDA is an executive agency. They don't write laws, they just execute the laws Congress writes. But laws are often really vague.
Right, and the prevailing legal framework for dealing with that vagueness is known as Chevron deference, named after a landmark 1984 Supreme Court case.
Right, Chevron.
The Chevron doctrine essentially established this two-step test. Step 1 asks, did Congress speak directly to the precise question at issue?
And if they did?
If the statute is unambiguous, the agency must simply follow it. But Step 2 says, if the statute is silent or ambiguous on a specific issue, the courts will defer to the agency's interpretation as long as it's reasonable.
Well, under a normal Chevron analysis, the FDA's interpretation seems incredibly reasonable.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the statute says a drug affects the structure of the body. Nicotine clearly does that. Therefore, the FDA should get the deference to regulate it.
And that is exactly what the FDA banked on. But O'Connor bypassed a standard Chevron deference by utilizing an emerging legal philosophy that we now call the major questions doctrine.
The major questions doctrine. Let's dig into that.
She argued that you cannot read a single clause of a 1938 law in tonal isolation from the 60 years of legislative history that followed it. You have to read the law in context.
Ah. So she zoomed out from the micro definition of the word drug
Yeah.
and looked at the macro behavior of the people who actually write the laws.
Precisely. O'Connor conducted a massive historical audit. She documented how, since 1938, Congress had passed several distinct pieces of legislation specifically dealing with tobacco.
Like warning labels and stuff.
Exactly. They passed the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act of 1965, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act of 1969, and the Comprehensive Smoking Education Act of 1984.
Wow, so they were busy.
They were. Congress had painstakingly constructed a completely separate, distinct, and notably limited regulatory scheme for the tobacco industry.
So her argument hinges on legislative silence, then.
Exactly.
She's pointing out that during all those decades of writing specific tobacco bills, Congress was repeatedly presented with proposals to explicitly hand the FDA comprehensive jurisdiction over cigarettes. And time after time, Congress voted those proposals down or let them die in committee.
Right. She was treating Congress's refusal to act as a deliberate binding command.
That's fascinating.
Furthermore, she identified a massive structural paradox in the FDA's own argument.
Oh, what was the paradox?
Well, the core statutory mandate of the FDCA is that the agency must ensure that all drugs and devices on the market are safe and effective for their intended use.
Right. That's their whole job.
Exactly. But O'Connor pointed out the obvious contradiction. The FDA itself was openly admitting that cigarettes are fundamentally unsafe and ineffective for any therapeutic purpose whatsoever.
Oh, wow. I see the trap.
It's a huge trap.
If the FDA officially classifies cigarettes as a drug delivery device under the 1938 law, their own internal rulebook wouldn't allow them to just put warning labels on them or restrict youth access. The statute would mathematically require the FDA to ban cigarettes entirely from the United States.
Exactly the trap O'Connor highlighted. And Congress had made it explicitly clear across multiple statutes that they did not want a total prohibition on tobacco.
Right, because of the economy.
Exactly. They recognized it as a massive sector of the economy and a deeply entrenched social habit. They wanted it to remain a legal, albeit warned against, consumer product.
So what was her conclusion then?
Therefore, O'Connor concluded, Congress simply could not have intended for the 1938 FDCA to cover tobacco, because applying it would trigger a mandatory ban that Congress actively opposed.
Okay, this crystallizes the broader anxiety over the administrative state. It's a fear of regulatory overreach.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
O'Connor is essentially looking at an unelected executive agency, trying to assume total unilateral control over a multi-billion-dollar slice of the American economy.
Right.
If the FDA can seize that kind of power, using a creative reading of a 60-year-old law, a power Congress never explicitly voted to give them, then the agency is effectively bypassing the democratic process entirely. They are writing new legislation from the executive branch.
It is a profound defense of the separation of powers. O'Connor is telling the FDA. We recognize the public health crisis, and we recognize the manipulative tactics of the industry, but you do not have a blank check to fix every problem in society.
Your authority is strictly limited.
Right. Your authority is strictly limited to what the elected representatives of the people have written down.
Okay, let me push back on this, because this is where the constitutional theory feels entirely detached from the physical reality on the ground.
Let's hear it.
The FDA isn't trying to regulate the banking industry or highway construction. They're trying to regulate a chemical compound that alters human physiology.
Right.
When the court says Congress built a separate regulatory scheme for tobacco, they are functionally saying that a drug ceases to be a drug legally simply because it has a good lobbying firm.
That's one way to look at it, sure.
I mean, why does the fundamental nature of a substance change in the eyes of the law just because Congress lacked the political courage to label it correctly? Isn't the court elevating procedural semantics over the actual preservation of human life?
And that critique cuts right to the heart of why this case was so controversial.
It just feels so wrong.
From a public health perspective, it definitely looks like a tragic abdication of duty. But to steelman O'Connor's position, we have to understand the foundational architecture of the judiciary. If the court starts ignoring procedural semantics to achieve a desirable moral outcome, even one as universally supported as stopping adolescent smoking, they break the structural design that gives them their authority in the first place.
Okay, let's explore that structural design, because a lot of people look at a ruling like this and assume the justices are simply corrupt or, in the pocket of big tobacco or just playing partisan games.
Right, which is a common reaction.
But I want to understand the ideal they are striving for that makes O'Connor's stance deeply principled in her own eyes.
To do that, we have to rewind all the way back to the ratification of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton wrote a brilliant essay, Federalist number 78, where he defended the creation of an independent judiciary.
Oh, Federalist 78.
He famously described it as the least dangerous branch of the new government.
He called it the least dangerous because, unlike the president or Congress, the Supreme Court has no inherent mechanism to enforce its own will, right?
Exactly.
It doesn't command the military or control federal funding.
Right. Hamilton wrote that the judiciary possesses neither force nor will, but merely judgment. Their entire authority rests entirely on public legitimacy.
Which is pretty fragile when you think about it.
Very fragile. If the executive branch decides to simply ignore a Supreme Court ruling, the court has no army to deploy to enforce it. The only reason their rulings hold weight is because the American public and the other branches respect the process by which those rulings are derived.
So they have to believe the court is applying objective law, not personal preference.
Exactly.
So the system is engineered to force neutrality. That's why we grant them life tenure.
Bingo.
By stripping away the need to run for re-election, solicit campaign donations, or pander to a political base, we theoretically insulate them from the immediate passions of the mob. They don't have to consult a Gallup poll before deciding if the FDA has jurisdiction.
Life tenure is the shield. The written constitution and the written statutes are the anchor.
The anchor, right.
They are not philosophers tasked with discovering what is good or just in a broad moral sense. They are technicians tasked with reading a specific text and applying it.
Which is why they have to write those massive opinions.
Exactly. To prove they are doing the math correctly, they are required to publish exhaustively researched written opinions detailing their logical steps, citing previous precedents, and proving their work to the legal community and the public.
The ultimate modern encapsulation of this Hamiltonian ideal came during the 2005 Senate confirmation hearings for Chief Justice John Roberts.
Oh, the famous umpire metaphor.
Yes. He provided a metaphor that has really defined how the public is taught to view the court ever since. He told the Senate Judiciary Committee that judges are like baseball umpires. Umpires don't make the rules, he said. They apply them. It's my job to call balls and strikes and not to pitch or bat.
And that umpire metaphor is incredibly sticky because it promises fairness.
It feels very safe.
Right. The strike zone is an imaginary rectangle hovering over home plate. Its dimensions are fixed by the rulebook. The pitcher throws the ball at 100 miles an hour, and the umpire simply acts as a biological sensor, reporting on whether the ball passed through the rectangle or not.
They just observe reality.
Exactly. The umpire doesn't care if the batter is a rookie or a veteran, or if one team desperately needs a win. They just call the physical reality of the pitch.
I've always thought of it through a slightly different lens, actually. More like a legacy computer system.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, think about the Constitution and the historical statutes as this massive interconnected code base. The justices are essentially human software compilers.
Okay, tracking with you.
Their job is to take a modern input, like a 1996 FDA regulation, run it through the 1938 statutory subroutine, and output a legal result. If they do their job correctly, their own personal feelings about the input shouldn't matter at all. The code dictates the output.
That is a highly functional way to visualize it. If the code says the FDA cannot regulate tobacco, the software must output that result, even if the judge personally hates tobacco.
Right. But here is where both the umpire metaphor and my human software analogy encounter a catastrophic failure.
When the text isn't clear.
Exactly. What happens when the code itself is fundamentally ambiguous? What happens when the 1938 code base uses a broad term like drug, which made perfect sense to the programmers at the time, but it encounters a modern biological reality they never anticipated?
Right.
Or, to use Robert's metaphor, what happens when the edges of the strike zone are blurry and undefined?
Well, when the rulebook fails to provide a clear boundary, the ideal of the neutral, objective umpire completely collapses.
Oh, it crashes.
That ambiguity is exactly what caused the software to crash in the year 2000. It wasn't a unanimous decision to strike down the FDA's rule. It was a fractured, bitterly contested 5-4 split over the exact same text.
And this is the perfect pivot to examine the dissent. O'Connor looked at the blurry strike zone, factored in 60 years of congressional inaction, and called it a ball.
Right.
But 4 other justices, looking at the exact same pitch, called it a strike.
Let's talk about those 4 justices. Justice Stephen Breyer wrote the dissent, joined by Justices Stevens, Souter, and Ginsburg.
And Breyer's analysis was just as rigorous, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Breyer's analysis was just as legally rigorous as O'Connor's, but he approached the code base from an entirely different angle. He argued that the court didn't need to embark on a massive historical audit of subsequent congressional inaction.
What did he think they should do?
He said they only needed to read the plain English of the statute that actually granted the power.
Ah, so he went straight to the dictionary definition embedded in the 1938 FDCA.
Exactly. He noted that the FDCA explicitly defines a drug as an article intended to affect the structure or function of the body.
Which, again, nicotine definitely does.
Right. He then pointed to the FDA's mountain of evidentiary findings showing that cigarettes deliver pharmacologically active doses of nicotine, which alter brain chemistry, and that the manufacturers fully intended this effect to create addiction.
It's just hard facts.
Under a straightforward reading of the English language, Breyer argued, tobacco fits perfectly within the statutory definition of a drug and a device. The physical reality of the product satisfies the legal requirement of the text.
But how did Breyer address O'Connor's trap? Her argument that if the FDA claimed jurisdiction, their own safe and effective mandate would force them to completely ban cigarettes, which Congress clearly didn't want.
Breyer rejected the premise of the trap entirely.
Really? How?
He argued that the FDA possesses significant administrative flexibility. The statute requires the agency to regulate dangerous products to protect public health. Breyer pointed out that a sudden total prohibition of cigarettes would instantly thrust tens of millions of heavily addicted Americans into acute withdrawal.
Which would be a medical disaster.
And it would spawn a massive, unregulated, and likely more dangerous black market.
Oh, true. Like prohibition all over again.
Exactly. Therefore, allowing cigarettes to remain on the market but heavily restricting their marketing and access to minors was actually the most rational way to fulfill the FDA's mandate of protecting public health without causing a secondary crisis.
Wow, that's a really solid counterargument. But what about Congress's refusal to grant the FDA power over all those decades? How did he justify that?
Breyer essentially argued that congressional silence is not a law.
Interesting.
Just because Congress failed to pass a bill explicitly handing the FDA jurisdiction over tobacco does not mean they legally revoked the jurisdiction that the broad words of the 1938 Act already provided. You cannot use the inaction of a 1980s Congress to erase the enacted text of a 1930s Congress.
This clash between O'Connor and Breyer completely shatters the myth of plain meaning for me.
It really does.
I mean, we won't talk about rogue activist judges acting in bad faith here. We're looking at 9 of the most brilliant, exhaustively vetted legal minds in the country.
The absolute top of their field.
They all have access to the exact same 1938 text. They all have access to the exact same historical record of what Congress did or didn't do. They all understand the biological mechanics of nicotine. And yet, they divide perfectly down the middle, arriving at mutually exclusive conclusions about what the law actually commands.
Because it reveals the profound limitation of human language as a governing tool.
Language is messy.
It is. When Congress passes a law, they frequently use broad, sweeping terms. Sometimes this is done intentionally to achieve enough political consensus to get the bill passed. Other times, it's because the drafters simply cannot predict the technological, societal, or pharmaceutical advancements that will occur half a century later.
So the text eventually runs out of specific answers.
Exactly. The text runs out.
So when the text of the code is exhausted, what actually determines the output of the software?
Methodology.
Methodology.
Yes. The philosophy of how a judge approaches the act of reading. This is where the human element becomes entirely unavoidable.
Let's break down the mechanics of methodology, because this is where the theoretical legal debates actually translate into real-world power.
It's the most important part.
You often hear these philosophies tossed around: textualism, purposivism, originalism. But how do they actually operate on the ground when the text is ambiguous?
Let's use a classic hypothetical used in law schools to demonstrate this mechanic. It was famously debated by two legal scholars, H.L.A. Art and Lon Fuller, in the 1950s.
Okay, I love a good hypothetical. Lay it on me.
Imagine a town council passes a very simple, single-sentence statute. No vehicles are permitted in the public park.
Okay, sounds like a perfectly clear piece of code. If you drive a Honda Civic into the park, you get a ticket. The umpire calls a strike.
Exactly. The core application is obvious. But the edges of the strike zone get blurry very quickly. Let's run some inputs through your human software.
Let's do it.
A group of teenagers ride skateboards through the park. Are skateboards vehicles under the meaning of the statute?
Well, a textualist would look at the dictionary definition of a vehicle. A vehicle is a mechanism for transporting people or goods. A skateboard transports a person on wheels. Therefore, a skateboard is a vehicle. The teenagers get a ticket.
Okay, now a veteran who lost his legs in combat enters the park in a motorized electric wheelchair. It has a motor, it has wheels, it transports a person. Is it a vehicle?
Oh, wow. Okay, if I apply strict textualism, I am forced to say yes. It mechanically meets the definition of a vehicle. But ticketing a disabled veteran for using a wheelchair in a public space seems absurd and clearly not what the town council intended.
Which is exactly why a judge utilizing purposivism would reach a completely different result.
Oh, okay.
A purposivist looks beyond the isolated dictionary definition of the word vehicle and asks, what was the overarching purpose, the societal goal the town council was trying to achieve when they wrote this rule?
Right, probably keeping people safe.
Exactly. They were likely trying to prevent noise pollution, protect pedestrians from high-speed collisions, and preserve the tranquility of the grass. An electric wheelchair does not violate any of those purposes.
Right.
Therefore, the purposivist judge rules that a wheelchair is not a vehicle within the specific context of this statute.
But the purposivist approach opens up its own chaotic vulnerabilities, doesn't it?
Oh, big time. Give me an example.
Let's say a local historical society wants to mount a fully decommissioned World War II tank on a concrete pedestal in the center of the park as a memorial. It has no engine, the treads are welded shut, it cannot move. Is it a vehicle?
See, the purposivist might say yes, allow the memorial, because a stationary metal statue doesn't threaten pedestrians or create noise, which aligns with the purpose of a tranquil park.
But the textualists would lose their mind over that.
They absolutely would. The textualist looks at the purposivist and says, you are rewriting the law. A tank is the literal definition of a vehicle. If the town council wanted an exception for memorials, they should have written an exception into the text.
You're just replacing the law with your own personal preference for veterans' memorials.
Precisely.
This simple park rule perfectly illustrates the collision in the tobacco case. Breyer is operating heavily as a purposivist. The overarching purpose of the 1938 FDCA was to protect public health from dangerous chemicals, so we should read the word drug expansively to capture nicotine.
Yes.
And O'Connor is applying a more structural, textualist approach, looking at the specific architecture of all the statutes combined and refusing to expand the agency's power without explicit new text.
And here is the ultimate realization for this deep dive. Choosing whether to be a textualist or a purposivist is inherently a human value judgment.
Because the Constitution doesn't tell them which one to pick.
Exactly. The Constitution does not contain a master key telling judges which methodology to use. The deciding variable in a 5-4 Supreme Court case is rarely the objective words on the page. The deciding variable is the deeply held foundational worldview of the human beings tasked with reading those words.
Which brings us right back to the agonizing human stakes of FDA v. Brown and Williamson.
Sobering.
It is. We are talking about cigarettes, a product that causes hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths every single year. We are talking about adolescent addiction on a massive scale. And the decision of whether the federal government has the power to intervene and save lives came down to an honest philosophical coin flip between jurists. A 5-4 split.
A single vote.
If just one justice had embraced purposivism over structural textualism, or if a different president had appointed a slightly different legal scholar to that seat a decade earlier, the exact same 1938 text would have meant something entirely different. The FDA would have begun regulating the tobacco industry in the year 2000.
It's incredible to think about.
It is impossible to look at that reality and maintain the illusion that the umpire is simply a passive observer of an immovable strike zone. In the hardest cases, The umpire's perspective defines the strike zone.
It is a sobering realization. But, before we declare the system entirely broken, we have to look at how the architecture of the government responds to a 5-4 structural blockade like this.
Right, because the story didn't end in 2000.
No, the Supreme Court's ruling in 2000 was not the end of the timeline. The system is designed with checks and balances, and when the court tells an executive agency they lack the statutory power, the burden shifts back to the branch that actually writes the code.
It shifts back to Congress.
Yeah.
If the software crashes because the 1938 code is ambiguous, you have to hire the programmers to write an update.
Precisely. And that legislative update eventually happened, though it was an agonizingly slow process.
9 years, right.
Yes. We fast forward 9 years. From the ruling in 2000 to the year 2009, the political landscape had shifted, public pressure had intensified, and Congress finally passed the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act.
And this act wasn't ambiguous at all.
Not in the slightest.
It explicitly, undeniably granted the FDA the exact comprehensive authority over the tobacco industry that the Supreme Court had said they lacked 9 years earlier. It gave them the power to regulate ingredients, demand rigorous new warning labels, and strictly enforce marketing bans targeting youth.
In a structural sense, the passage of the 2009 Act actually provides a powerful validation of Justice O'Connor's majority opinion.
Really? How so?
Well, you can strongly disagree with the public health outcome of her ruling, but constitutionally, her decision forced the system to operate as intended. She told the administrative state, "You cannot seize this immense economy-altering power through administrative creativity. If you want this jurisdiction, you must force the democratic process to function. You must make Congress vote on it."
Okay, I see that. It's a victory for constitutional hygiene. It ensures that major shifts in domestic policy are driven by elected representatives who are accountable to the voters, rather than unelected bureaucrats utilizing creative interpretations of 60-year-old laws.
That is the Madisonian ideal right there. The founders deliberately designed the American system to be deeply inefficient.
Which sounds crazy, but it's true.
They divided power across 3 branches and 2 houses of Congress specifically to create friction, to make it incredibly difficult for the government to act quickly, thereby preventing sudden tyrannical shifts in power.
I understand the theoretical elegance of that friction. I really do. But as a clinician, the real-world cost of that inefficiency is incredibly difficult to swallow.
I can only imagine.
We waited 9 years for Congress to update the code. Between the court striking down the FDA's rule in 2000 and Congress finally acting in 2009, millions of teenagers started smoking. Millions developed lifelong addictions, and an untold number of people suffered devastating health consequences while the government was paralyzed by a debate over statutory interpretation and congressional gridlock.
It's a massive human toll.
We are constantly trying to govern a hyper-accelerated 21st century society dealing with advanced pharmaceuticals, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and global data privacy, using a statutory code base written in the 1930s, or even the 1800s. Feels like trying to regulate a smartphone industry using the rulebook designed for the telegraph.
And the burden of that technological acceleration is exactly why executive agencies like the FDA, the EPA, or the FCC constantly try to stretch their old mandates to cover new realities.
Because Congress won't act.
Right. Congress is frequently too gridlocked to pass modern, updated laws. So the agencies step into the void, which inevitably leads right back to the Supreme Court for massive showdowns over regulatory overreach and the Chevron deference. The 2009 legislative override solved the tobacco issue, but it didn't resolve the underlying tension at all.
Right. It didn't prove Breyer right and O'Connor wrong about how to read the 1938 statute. It just mooted the debate.
Exactly.
The fundamental vulnerability, the fact that reasonable jurists utilizing different methodologies can look at the same law and reach completely incompatible conclusions based on their own worldviews, remains entirely intact.
Which serves as the perfect blueprint for everything we will explore in this series moving forward for you guys listening.
It's the whole ballgame.
Once you recognize the human element driving the methodology in the 2000 tobacco case, you cannot unsee it. You realize that the Supreme Court has never been a room full of dispassionate, infallible umpires. It has always been a collection of highly educated, deeply flawed human beings, profoundly shaped by the eras they lived in, their socioeconomic backgrounds, and their foundational political philosophies.
They are making profound, society-altering choices in the gray areas where the text runs out. And so we're going to use this realization to establish 2 vital, unavoidable questions that will serve as our compass for all future explorations of landmark cases on this show.
The first question we will ask of every single major decision is this: did the court follow the law, or did it follow its politics?
And we have to analyze that question fairly. We aren't looking for crude corruption here, like a judge taking a bribe or receiving direct orders from a party chairman.
Right, it's rarely that simple.
It's way more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at the pervasive ways that a judge's macro-political philosophy, their inherent beliefs about federal power versus states' rights, or the free market versus labor protections, determines the methodology they choose when the law is ambiguous. We are examining how deeply held worldviews masquerade as objective textual analysis.
And the second question is inextricably linked to the first. Who put these particular 9 justices in those seats?
Because they don't just appear out of nowhere.
No, the justices don't emerge organically from the Constitution. They are nominated by a president who holds a specific ideological mandate, and they are confirmed by a Senate that operates as an intensely partisan battlefield.
The machinery is huge.
The identity of the deciders and the vast political machinery that compromised, negotiated, and fought to install them is the invisible architecture behind every decision they make. If you change the personnel on the bench, you change the literal meaning of the law.
So moving forward, we're going to apply these 2 questions to the most seismic moments in American history. The moments where the human software encountered a massive societal bug and the umpire's story visibly strained or broke entirely.
We are really going to dive into the deep end.
We will examine how this ambiguity operates in the darkest chapters of our history. We will look at the Dred Scott decision in 1857, where the court arrogantly attempted to solve the political crisis of slavery by reading their own racial prejudices into the text of the Constitution, effectively igniting the Civil War.
A horrific miscalculation.
Unbelievable. We will look at Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, where the majority utilized a twisted methodology to claim that separate but equal segregation was a neutral reading of the 14th Amendment, and will study the lonely dissent in that case to prove that a different purposivist reading was always available.
We'll also dive into the Lochner era of the early 20th century.
Oh, that's a fascinating one.
Where a conservative majority repeatedly struck down basic worker protection laws like limits on the hours a baker could work by reading their own aggressive, laissez-faire capitalist economic theories into the word liberty in the Due Process Clause. They were acting as a super legislature, vetoing economic policies they philosophically opposed.
We will cover Korematsu in 1944, demonstrating that the court is rarely immune to the overwhelming political gravity and panic of a wartime executive branch, upholding the internment of Japanese Americans.
Such a dark stain on the court's history.
Yeah. We will explore institutional showdowns, too, like FDR's 1937 court packing plan, where a wildly popular president, furious that his New Deal legislation kept getting struck down by the court's textualists, openly threatened to expand the bench and swamp it with his own purposivist judges.
Which really highlights how the court's independence is constantly tethered to the political branch's willingness to tolerate it.
Exactly. We will trace the evolution of the modern confirmation wars, analyzing how the process of selecting justices mutated from a relatively quiet collegial Senate procedure into open, high-stakes political combat, largely because both parties now fully embrace the reality that confirming a justice is about securing a predictable methodology on the bench for a generation.
And we will apply this lens to the massive modern shifts, like the overturning of a half-century of precedent in the Dobbs decision regarding abortion. Yeah. We will examine how a sudden strategic shift in the personnel of the court, engineered by bare-knuckle political maneuvering in the Senate, resulted in a massive, immediate reversal of constitutional rights, entirely independent of any new legislation from Congress.
Finally, we will tackle the contemporary debates surrounding the institution itself. The proposals for term limits, the arguments for court expansion, the demands for binding ethics reform. These are not just academic exercises. They're the urgent reactions of an American public waking up to the reality that the court wields immense, largely unchecked political power.
It's going to be an intense ride.
It is. But as we embark on this historical deep dive, I want to establish our core operating principle for everyone listening. We're not here to name villains. We're not going to portray one side of the judicial spectrum as malicious and the other as righteous. We are going to rigorously steelman every perspective, presenting the arguments as the brilliant legal minds of the time understood them. We want you to feel the agonizing difficulty of these 5-4 splits.
But our commitment to fairness will not indulge the fantasy of pure neutrality. We will refuse to pretend that the strike zone never moves.
No way.
We will treat the court as what it truly is, a profoundly powerful, profoundly flawed human institution tasked with the impossible job of governing a complex, evolving nation through the interpretation of old words.
So to bring us back to where we started today, I open with my own lingering shock as a medical professional, staring at the biological reality of nicotine addiction and feeling utterly bewildered when the Supreme Court told the FDA they couldn't intervene. It felt like a denial of empirical science.
But by tracing the mechanics of the ruling, hopefully, we moved from that initial shock to a deeper appreciation for the complex reality of statutory interpretation.
I think we did.
We saw how Justice O'Connor's decision was not a denial of biology, but a principled defense of the separation of powers. We saw how she demanded that the democratic process function, forcing Congress to take responsibility for expanding the government's reach.
And we also saw how Justice Breyer's dissent highlighted the counterprinciple, that the plain words of a law must be respected and that executive agencies require the interpretive flexibility to protect the public from sophisticated, evolving threats. We watched 9 brilliant minds run the exact same code and crash into a 5-4 split, proving that when the text is ambiguous, human philosophy inevitably fills the void.
The umpire metaphor remains a beautiful, necessary aspiration that guides a massive portion of the court's daily work, but it breaks down entirely in the hardest, most consequential cases, precisely when society needs an objective answer the most.
Which leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to carry forward after this deep dive. We've spent an hour dissecting a fractured, agonizing 5-4 decision, but statistically, the vast majority of the Supreme Court's output every year is actually unanimous or heavily lopsided.
Right, the 9-year rulings.
Yes, 9-year rulings occur constantly on routine matters of tax law, bankruptcy codes, and procedural disputes. They agree on a massive amount of the code base.
The explosive partisan splits represent a distinct minority of their total caseload.
So here is the question I want you to explore on your own. When we focus all of our civic anxiety, all of our media outrage, and all of our historical analysis on those explosive 5-4 splits, are we making a fundamental analytical error? Are we allowing the messy, highly politicized 10% of cases to unfairly define the entire institution? Is it inaccurate to call the court a political body just because its software crashes on the absolute hardest edge cases?
That's a great question.
Or, and this is the flip side, is it exactly the opposite? Is it exactly in those fractured, fiercely contested margins, the cases that deal with our most fundamental rights, the scope of federal power, public health, and the basic architecture of our society? Is it precisely in those margins where the polite, unanimous agreements of routine law fall away and the true underlying human nature of the court is finally unavoidably forced into the light?
That is something to chew on.
If the umpire only struggles to define the strike zone when the game is tied in the bottom of the 9th inning, with the season on the line, does it really matter how flawlessly they called the first 8 innings? Think about it. Until next time, we'll see you in the deep end.